The silence in this house has a texture. It is heavy, velvet, thick, and suffocating. It presses against my eardrums, louder in its own way than the storm raging against the French doors of the kitchen. I stood there, my hand resting on the cold marble of the countertop, watching the rain dismantle the world outside. It was a torrential downpour, the kind that turns the sky a bruised, violent purple and drowns the horizon in gray sheets of water. Inside, the air was still, filtered, and perfectly controlled, smelling faintly of lemon polish and the expensive beeswax candles Elias insists we burn in the evenings. But beneath that curated, sterile scent, something else was creeping in from the edges of the window frames, the smell of damp earth, of worms surfacing, of old stone breathing in the moisture. Elias was gone. A business trip to Zurich, he had said, leaving with his immaculate leather valise and a peck on my cheek that felt as dry as parchment. When Elias is away, the house holds its breath. I usually find myself walking on tiptoe, afraid to disturb the phantom of his perfectionism. Every cushion remained plumped, every coaster aligned. But, looking out at the garden, I felt a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. His garden. It was his sanctuary, his obsession, his altar, the prize-winning rose garden that had been featured in Better Homes and Gardens just last month. From the safety of the kitchen, I watched the wind whip the crimson glory bushes into a frenzy. They thrashed against the gale, their dark, thorny branches clawing at the air. And then, I saw it, the retaining wall, the low, dry stone barrier that held the tiered beds in place, had given way. A section of stones had collapsed under the relentless assault of the water, spilling a slurry of mud and debris onto the pristine gravel path below. Panic, irrational and sharp, spiked in my chest. Elias would be home in 2 days. If he returned to find his garden in ruins, the mood in this house would shift from heavy silence to a terrifying, icy rage. He wouldn't shout. Elias never shouted, but he would look at me with that disappointed, hollow stare that made me feel small, incompetent. I couldn't let him see it like this. I moved before I could talk myself out of it. I hurried to the mudroom, the sound of my own breathing loud in the empty hallway. I pulled on my heavy rubber Wellington boots, the green ones that always felt a size too big, and threw my yellow oilskin raincoat over my cashmere sweater. The material crinkled stiffly, a foreign sound in the quiet house. I grabbed the heavy iron key to the garden shed and unlocked the back door. The wind hit me like a physical blow. It snatched the door from my hand, slamming it against the exterior brickwork with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. I flinched, stepping out into the deluge. Instantly, the cold seeped through the layers of my clothing. The rain wasn't just falling, it was driving sideways, stinging my exposed cheeks like handfuls of thrown gravel. I lowered my head, squinting against the onslaught, and trudged toward the collapsed wall. The ground was a quagmire. My boots sank inches deep into the lawn with every step, making a wet, sucking sound as I pulled them free. The smell of the earth was overpowering out here, raw, metallic, and overwhelming. When I reached the crimson glory bed, the damage was worse than it had looked from the window. The soil, saturated and heavy, had slid away, exposing the thick, woody roots of the prize rosebush. I scrambled to the shed, my fingers fumbling with the latch, and grabbed a spade and a trowel. I had to shore it up. I had to push the earth back, repack the stones, make it look untouched. I knelt in the mud, disregarding the way the cold sludge soaked instantly through the knees of my trousers. I began to shovel, my movements frantic, breathless. I scraped the heavy, wet clay, piling it back against the roots, trying to rebuild the slope. The rain plastered my hair to my forehead, blinding me, but I kept digging. I was terrified of the roots being exposed to the cold air. Elias had told me once that these roses were delicate, that they required sacrifice to bloom so beautifully. I reached for a large stone to wedge back into the wall, digging my trowel deep into the slurry to create a bed for it. Clink. The sound was sharp, dissonant against the dull thud of rain and mud, metal on metal. I paused, my heart hammering against my ribs. I thought I had hit a rock, or perhaps a piece of old piping. I dug again, more carefully this time, scraping away the dense, black soil. The trowel snagged on something hard. I reached down, my gloved fingers brushing against a circular shape. It was lodged deep, buried at least 3 feet down, right beneath where the main root ball of the rosebush sat. I pulled it free. It was a heavy lump of clay, small and round. I sat back on my heels, the rain washing over me, and wiped the object against the rubberized front of my raincoat. The mud smeared away, revealing a dull, yellow glint. Gold. I froze. It was a ring, a heavy, wide band, a wedding band. I stripped off my muddy glove, my bare hand shaking in the freezing rain. I took the ring, feeling its substantial weight. It wasn't mine. My ring is platinum, a slender, modern thing. This was old-fashioned, thick gold. I brought it closer to my face, squinting through the water dripping from my eyelashes. The rain acted as a cleanser, washing away the last of the garden grit. There was an inscription on the inside. I tilted it to catch the gray afternoon light. To Clara, my eternal rose 2020. The breath left my body as if I'd been punched. Clara. Clara was Elias's first wife, the woman who had lived in this house before me, the woman whose taste still lingered in the wallpaper of the guest room, in the china patterns Elias refused to throw away. Elias had told me the story 100 times. He had told me with a sad, resigned sigh that Clara had left him. She had run away with a lover, an Italian architect she met at a gallery opening. She took everything, Martha, Elias had said, his eyes wet with betrayal. She packed her bags, took her jewelry, her clothes, her passport, and she vanished to Tuscany. She didn't even leave a note. I looked down at the ring in my palm. 2020, the year she disappeared. The cold was no longer just from the rain. It was seeping out of the gold band, freezing my blood. If Clara had run away to start a new life with a lover, if she had taken everything she owned to Italy, then why was her wedding ring buried 3 feet deep in the dirt, entangled in the roots of the rosebush Elias had planted the very week she went missing? I looked up at the crimson glory. The blooms were heavy with rainwater, drooping like heads bowed in prayer. They were famous in the county for their color, red so deep, so rich, it was almost black. Elias always said the soil here was special. I stared at the dark red petals, shivering violently, and realized with a sick, lurching horror that perhaps the soil was special. Why are the roses blooming so unnaturally red this year? I locked the back door. The bolt slid home with a heavy, mechanical thud that usually made me feel secure, but tonight, it felt like I was sealing myself inside a tomb. I stood in the mudroom for a long moment, shivering uncontrollably. Water dripping from the hem of my yellow raincoat onto the slate tiles. The house was silent again, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was watching. I peeled off the wet coat and left the boots in a puddle, moving into the kitchen in my stocking feet. I went straight to the farmhouse sink. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely turn the tap. The water ran hot, steaming against the cold porcelain. I held the clotted lump of clay under the stream. The water turned brown, swirling away into the drain, taking the garden soil with it. Slowly, the gold emerged. It was bright, untarnished by its time in the earth. I set it down on the ceramic edge of the sink. Clink. The sound was tiny, sharp, and incredibly loud. It echoed off the marble countertops, sounding like a gunshot in the vast, quiet house. I stared at it. To Clara, my mind, desperate for logic, tried to reject what my eyes were seeing. Maybe she lost it. Maybe she threw it away in a fit of rage before she left. But the timeline was a jagged tear in the fabric of the story Elias had woven for me. I needed to verify it. I needed to be sure before I let the panic fully take hold. The memory hit me then, vivid and nauseating. It was a dinner conversation, barely 6 months ago. We were sitting at the mahogany dining table, the room lit by the soft glow of the chandelier. Elias was eating a rare steak, his knife moving with surgical precision. I had asked him, innocently, if Clara had ever tried to contact him after she settled in Italy. I closed my eyes, standing at the sink, and I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were standing behind me. Clara was chaotic. Martha, he had said, slicing through the meat. She was a creature of impulse. She packed her bags in an hour. I didn't even get to say goodbye. I came home, and the closets were empty. The jewelry box was swept clean. She took everything. I remembered the way the serrated knife scraped against the fine china, harsh, grating rasp. I remembered looking at his hands, strong and manicured, as he lifted a piece of steak to his mouth. There was no sadness in his eyes. There was only a cool, detached finality. At the time, I thought it was the stoicism of a man who had been hurt. Now, standing in the gray light of the kitchen, remembering the red juice of the steak on his plate, the memory felt sinister, predatory. She took everything, he had insisted. I turned away from the sink, leaving the ring sitting there like an accusation. I needed to know what everything meant. I walked to the hallway and looked up the staircase. The attic. Elias never went up there. He claimed it was full of dust and irritated his sinuses. But he had told me once that there were a few boxes of junk he hadn't gotten around to donating, things that were too damaged for Clara to take but too sentimental to throw away immediately. I climbed the stairs, the wood creaking under my weight. The air grew thinner, hotter, and smellier the higher I went. I pulled the cord for the attic hatch, and the ladder slid down with a groan of rusty springs. The attic was a cavern of shadows. Rain drummed deafeningly on the roof tiles directly above my head. It smelled of dry rot, cedar, and neglect. I navigated through the maze of covered furniture, my flashlight beam cutting through the dancing dust motes. In the far corner, tucked behind a stack of old holiday decorations, sat a steamer trunk. It was covered in a thick layer of gray fuzz. I knelt before it, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wiped the dust away from the latch. It wasn't locked. I threw the lid back. Inside, it looked like a hasty dump of unwanted items. Old curtains, a broken lamp, some books. I began to dig, tossing the musty fabric aside. My hand brushed against something smooth and cool. I pulled it out. It was a handbag, a structured oxblood leather tote. Expensive. I recognized the brand. It was heavy. Why would a woman running away to a new life leave her favorite purse? I opened the clasp. A waft of scent rose from the interior, faint but undeniable. Lavender. It was the smell of a ghost. My hands shook as I reached inside. I pulled out a wallet. Cash, hundreds of dollars, crisp and untouched. I pulled out a set of keys, a lipstick, and then, the final piece, the item that shattered the last of my denial. A blue booklet with gold lettering, a passport. I flipped it open. Clara's face stared back at me, unsmiling, her eyes wide. The expiration date was 2028. I sat back on my heels, the passport burning my fingers. You don't run away to Italy without a passport. You don't leave your cash, your keys, and your wedding ring buried in the dirt. Clara hadn't gone to Tuscany. Clara hadn't gone anywhere. Riing. The sound of the phone in my pocket made me scream. I scrambled backward, dropping the passport into the trunk. I fumbled for the device, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The screen lit up the dark attic. Caller ID. Elias. I stared at the name. My husband, the man who planted roses, the man who cut his steak with surgical precision. I couldn't ignore it. He would know. If I didn't answer, he would check the security cameras. He would see me. I swiped answer, pressing the phone to my ear. I tried to steady my voice, but my throat felt constricted by wire. Hello, Martha. His voice was smooth, warm, rich like melted chocolate. It was the voice I fell in love with. I'm just checking in, darling. The storm looks dreadful on the news. Is everything all right at the house? It's fine, I lied, looking down at the open trunk, at the dead woman's passport, just a little loud with the rain. Good, he purred. There was a pause, a silence that stretched too long. And the garden. How are my roses, Martha? Make sure they're getting enough water. You know how much they need to thrive. A chill that had nothing to do with the storm swept through me. I looked at the passport, then thought of the ring downstairs on the sink, and finally, of the crimson glory bush fed on secrets and bone. They're fine, Elias, I whispered, realizing with terrifying clarity that I was trapped in a house with a monster. Everything is exactly where you left it. The sound of tires crunching on gravel is distinct. It is a grinding, aggressive noise, like bones being pulverized under a heavy weight. It cut through the drumming of the rain and the thudding of my own heart, freezing me in place. I was standing in the center of the kitchen, the evidence of a murder laid out on the island like a perverse buffet, the muddy gold ring, the oxblood leather bag, and the passport that Clara supposedly took to Italy. I looked at the digital clock on the oven. 7:15 p.m. Elias wasn't due back from Zurich until Tuesday. The phone call 5 minutes ago hadn't been a check-in from a hotel room. It had been a proximity test. He was already in the driveway. Panic, cold and electric, surged through my veins. I scrambled to gather the items. My hands were useless. Clumsy claws. I shoved the passport back into the bag, but the ring, that heavy, damning circle of gold, slipped from my fingers. It skittered across the marble counter, spinning with a mocking hum, and came to rest right at the edge. The front door opened. There was no sound of keys jangling, no fumbling, just the smooth, well-oiled click of the lock turning and the heavy swoosh of the oak door swinging inward. A gust of cold, wet air rushed down the hallway, carrying the scent of ozone and exhaust. Martha. His voice wasn't projected. He didn't shout. He spoke at a conversational volume, knowing the acoustics of the house would carry it to me. It was the confidence of a predator entering its own den. I backed up against the sink, my hand instinctively reaching behind me, fingers curling around the cold, wet rim of a heavy cast iron skillet I had left drying on the rack. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat had closed up. Elias appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. He looked immaculate. His charcoal suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, his hair slicked back, but his eyes were dead. They swept the room, cataloging everything in a single heartbeat. He saw the muddy footprints I had tracked in from the garden, dark stains on his perfect travertine floors. He saw the open attic hatch reflected in the hallway mirror. And then, his gaze landed on the kitchen island. He walked forward, his steps measured. He didn't look at me. He picked up the ring. He held it up to the light, just as I had done, turning it slowly. "I thought I buried that deep enough," he said. His voice was a whisper, a terrifyingly calm sound that was infinitely worse than a scream. He looked at me then, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. "The rain always ruins everything, doesn't it? It washes away the work. It exposes the mess." "You killed her," I breathed. The words tasted like copper. "You told me she left. You told me she was in Tuscany." Elias sighed, the sound of a man bored by a repetitive conversation. He set the ring down gently. "She wanted to leave, Martha. She was packing. She was going to take half the assets and leave me in this big, empty house. Nobody leaves me." He took a step toward me, loosening his cup. "And besides, the garden was struggling that year. The soil was depleted. It needed tending. It needed substance." The room spun. "Substance. She's part of this place now," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a vibration in the floorboards. "She feeds the beauty. The crimson glory has never bloomed so vividly. It's her legacy, a useful one, just like you will be." He lunged out. It wasn't a movie fight. It was fast, ugly, and desperate. He closed the distance with terrifying speed. I swung the cast iron skillet with both hands, a blind, shrieking arc of defense. It connected with his shoulder with a sickening thud of metal on bone. Elias grunted, stumbling back, his perfect composure shattering for a split second. "You stupid bitch," he hissed, clutching his arm. I didn't wait. I turned and ran for the French doors. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers slick with sweat and terror. I heard him recovering behind me, the heavy slap of his dress shoes on the stone floor. The latch gave way, and I threw myself out into the storm. The wind hit me like a wall. The rain was blinding, a vertical river drowning the world. I didn't have my boots on. My stocking feet slipped on the wet patio stones, and I went down hard, skinning my palms. I scrambled up, crawling, then running toward the driveway, toward the road, screaming into the gale. "Help! Someone help me!" My voice was swallowed by the thunder. I reached the edge of the driveway just as the world exploded in blue and red light. I had pressed the silent panic alarm behind the toaster oven the moment I heard his car tires. I had forgotten I did it in the haze of fear, but the private security firm had been faster than I dared hope. A patrol car screeched to a halt at the gates, lights flashing, illuminating the falling rain in strobe-like bursts of color. I collapsed onto the wet asphalt, pointing a shaking hand back, toward the house, toward the prize-winning garden, the roses. I screamed at the bewildered officer running toward me. "Dig up the roses." The officer looked at me, then up at the house. I turned my head, gasping for air, rain plastering my hair to my skull. Elias was standing in the kitchen window. The lights were off inside, making him a silhouette framed by the flashing police strobes. He wasn't running. He wasn't trying to escape out the back. He was just standing there, one hand resting on the glass, watching me. And as the lightning flashed, illuminating his face in a stark, white glare, I saw the most terrifying thing of all. He was smiling, not a smile of defeat, but a smile of patience. Why would a man caught red-handed look at his accuser with such serene, confident amusement? The transition from the suffocating silence of a tomb to the chaotic noise of a crime scene is jarring. It is a violence of its own. The storm had finally broken, reduced to a miserable, spitting drizzle. But the peace I had sought in this house was shattered forever. The driveway, usually so pristine, with its raked gravel, was now a parking lot of official vehicles. Blue and red lights strobed against the wet facade of the manor, turning the elegant stonework into a grotesque, shifting hallucination. I sat on the edge of the ambulance, the metal bumper cold beneath my legs. A paramedic had draped a shock blanket around my shoulders, a scratchy synthetic wool thing that smelled of antiseptic and storage. I pulled it tighter, not because I was cold, but because I felt like I might fly apart if I didn't bind myself together. From my vantage point, I could see the garden. They had set up portable tall skeletal stands that blasted harsh, white light onto the crimson glory bed. The artificial glare bleached the romance out of the landscape, exposing the mud, the torn grass, and the ugly reality of the earth. The shadows that had hidden Elias's secrets were banished, replaced by the clinical scrutiny of men in white Tyvek suits. I watched them work. They didn't use trowels or hand. They didn't whisper to the plants or worry about damaging the delicate root systems. They used heavy spades and picks. They attacked the earth with a brutal efficiency that made me flinch. The sound of metal striking wet soil was rhythmic and sickening. Thud, squelch, thud. A detective, a wary-looking woman with rain-darkened hair, walked over to me. She held a clear plastic evidence bag open. "Mrs. Blackwood," she asked, her voice soft but insistent. "The ring." I looked down at my hand. My fingers were still clenched around the heavy gold band. The mud had dried into the crevices of the engraving. "To Clara." I uncurled my fingers, my joints stiff and aching. I dropped the ring into the plastic bag. It hit the bottom with a dull plastic rattle. No longer a piece of jewelry, but a piece of evidence. "Thank you," she said. She hesitated, looking back toward the garden where the men were now waist-deep in the hole. "You shouldn't watch this part." "I have to," I whispered. "I lived here. I watered them." She didn't argue. She walked away, the bag swaying in her grip. I turned my gaze back to the light. The digging had stopped. The men in the white suits were moving slower now, their body language shifting from labor to preservation. One of them signaled to a photographer. The flash of the camera popped, snap, 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 white lightning capturing the horror in high definition. They began to lift something out. It wasn't just bones. The crimson glory had been planted directly on top of her. The thick, woody roots had not just grown around her. They had embraced her. They had woven through the ribcage, tangled with the remains of what looked like a heavy wool coat. The plant and the woman had become one entity. The roses hadn't just been hiding Clara. They had been consuming her. I felt bile rise in my throat. I thought of Elias standing at the kitchen window, sipping his morning espresso, watching the blooms with that look of proud satisfaction. I thought of how he would stroke the petals, how he would tell me that the secret to a prize-winning garden was commitment. He hadn't been mourning a runaway wife. He had been admiring his own handiwork. He had turned his crime into a centerpiece. Every time he complimented the deep, velvety red of the flowers, he was laughing at me. He was laughing at the world. He had made me an accomplice, handing me the watering can, telling me to ensure they got enough hydration. "How are my roses, Martha?" The radio on the detective's shoulder crackled with static. "Dispatch, we have a second anomaly in Sector 4, under the hydrangeas. Looks like another cache." I froze. The hydrangeas, the blue ones, the ones he planted 5 years before he met Clara. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Clara wasn't the first, and I wasn't going to be the last. The garden wasn't a sanctuary. It was a graveyard. A collection. Every prize-winning bush, every vibrant display of color, was a marker for a different woman who had tried to leave him. He wasn't a gardener. He was a curator of death. The police were escorting Elias out of the house now. He was handcuffed, flanked by 2 officers. He didn't look disheveled. He walked with his head high, his expression one of mild annoyance, as if this were all just a bureaucratic misunderstanding. As they guided him past the ambulance, he turned his head. Our eyes locked. The strobe lights washed him in blue, then red. He didn't look angry. He looked at me with a terrifying, pitying disappointment. He glanced at the ruined rosebush, then back at me, and gave a small shrug. "You ruined the aesthetic," his eyes seemed to say. They shoved him into the back of a squad car. The door slammed, severing the connection. "Mrs. Blackwood, we're ready to take you to the hospital now," the paramedic said, placing a hand on my arm. "Yes," I said, my voice hollow. "Take me away from here." I climbed into the back of the ambulance, the doors closing out the rain and the lights. As the vehicle pulled away, crunching over the same gravel Elias had driven over an hour ago, I looked out the back window one last time. The house stood tall and imposing against the night sky. A beautiful, perfect lie. But the garden was destroyed. The earth was churned up, raw and ugly. The crimson glory lay on its side on a plastic tarp, its roots exposed to the cold air, its dark red petals scattered in the mud like drops of blood. He said she ran away, but she never left. She was blooming right outside my window the whole time, waiting for the rain to wash the lies away. Secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel. I have many more locked away in this library. Waiting for you.